When Ethan and his sworn enemy, Leo, first materialized in the opulent penthouse, there was still enough residual animosity between them for a fight. That was until Ethan realized the name of Leo's husband by arranged marriage was Julian Vance. And the patron who was bankrolling his own life was Marcus Thorne. The names clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. Matching the characters from a trashy romance novel he'd been scrolling through right before they were inexplicably transported here. What a coincidence. The moment he laid out the situation, the sneer on Leo's face evaporated. He vaguely recalled the book Ethan had sent him, a link he'd opened with morbid curiosity. The first page depicted the main character and his universally despised husband in a series of hateful, almost pathological encounters. It had been so grotesque he'd slammed his laptop shut and fired off an angry text to Ethan about his terrible taste. Remembering this, Leo's complexion shifted between shades of pale green and stark white. Ethan, recalling the same thing, couldn't suppress a burst of laughter. Leo shot him a venomous glare, but before he could formulate a retort, Julian Vance himself swept into the room and seized him by the arm. As he was being dragged away, Ethan overheard Julian's clipped instruction that it was a family dinner and Leo had better play his part convincingly. Leo, however, was not the meek, easily manipulated spouse from the novel. He rolled his eyes with theatrical flair and asked if non-compliance would result in a divorce. Julian's jaw tightened in fury. But, by a strange twist of fate, the character and Leo shared a core trait. They were both utterly avaricious. Just as Ethan was marveling at Leo's recklessness, Julian produced a card from his pocket. He slapped it against Leo's cheek with sharp finality, stating that if he performed well, it was his. Leo picked it up with a look of profound disdain. Ethan made a dismissive sound. Julian added that there was $10 million on it. Leo's eyes lit up. He assured Julian it would be a pleasure. In that moment, Ethan wished with all his being that it was his face being struck by a high-limit CR card. A sharp voice cut through his thoughts, asking why he hadn't been answering his phone. Ethan flinched, turning to meet a pair of severe, penetrating eyes. It was the novel's other male lead, Marcus Thorne. Marcus held up his phone with a cold smirk, displaying a long list of unanswered calls glowing in crimson. He'd begun to think Ethan was dead. Ethan remained silent, unsure how to respond to such a morbid greeting. Marcus warned him that since he'd signed the contract, he was expected to fulfill his duties as a stand-in and not entertain any foolish ideas beyond his station. Ethan just nodded. He recalled the contract stipulated a payment of $20,000 a month. The stark contrast made him laugh, a bitter, self-deprecating sound. Marcus, incensed by this inexplicable amusement, grabbed Ethan's wrist and began pulling him along. Stumbling behind him, Ethan felt a deep sense of despair. His miserable days were just beginning. In the time that followed, Ethan devoted himself to hoarding money. While the contract paid modestly, Marcus was generous with gifts. Cars, apartments, an endless parade of expensive jewelry. Ethan sold everything he could, quietly amassing a small fortune. Occasional meetings with Leo, punctuated by his caustic remarks, gave him something to look forward to. Lately, however, a persistent twitch in his eyelid filled him with a potent sense of foreboding. He mentioned it to Leo, who dismissed it, reminding him that his sixth sense had never once been accurate. A few days later, Leo called for an urgent meeting. The first thing he did was point to his own right eye, declaring that it had twitched twice yesterday. Ethan nodded patiently. Leo insisted he had a terrible feeling. Ethan continued to nod. Annoyed, Leo demanded to know if Ethan wasn't worried about the original protagonists returning. Ethan shot to his feet, slamming his phone down on the table in front of Leo. He yelled, asking if those two spheres under his eyebrows were just for decoration. The main character's return had been all over the celebrity news sites for a day, and he was only just now figuring it out. Leo stared at the high-resolution photo of the protagonist on the screen, a sheepish grin spreading across his face. After a long moment, He slid a black CR card across the table. It was everything he had. He asked if Ethan was in. After a pause, he added that he had plenty of money, more than enough to support them both. Ethan produced his own card. 8 o'clock tonight, at the Bethesda fountain. He would run interference. Leo gave him an affirmative gesture. The escape plan was settled. After they parted ways, Ethan returned to the apartment Marcus had given him. He had grown fond of the things that were legally his, and he had decorated the space to be a warm, comfortable home where he spent most of his time. Marcus, too, seemed to prefer this place, spending nearly all his non-travel time there. Today was no exception. The moment he walked in, he crossed to the sofa where Ethan was watching television and kissed him twice. Ethan had to admit, the 2 years he'd spent as Marcus's substitute had been filled with perks. Marcus was handsome, incredibly fit, and paid him for the pleasure of his company. If it weren't for the contract, Ethan might have even believed Marcus was genuinely in love with him. Like now, Marcus held him, their lips meeting in a deep, lingering kiss. When they broke apart, he would place a soft, final peck on the corner of Ethan's mouth, letting the intimate atmosphere settle around them. Then he would pull away with a smile, suggesting they eat first so Ethan wouldn't be hungry later. After dinner, they didn't do anything physical. Marcus just held him, watching television in comfortable silence, or sometimes Ethan would watch as Marcus worked through his emails. They weren't intimate all that often. Not because Marcus wasn't capable. When they were, Ethan was usually sore for a day, but because it was infrequent, perhaps once every week or two. If he ever asked, Marcus would claim it was because he hated seeing Ethan in discomfort afterward, a justification Ethan never fully believed. As he settled into Marcus's arms after his shower, the plan with Leo weighed on his mind. He finally broke the silence, asking Marcus what he would do if one day, Ethan simply vanished. Marcus chuckled, replying that he would never leave. He amended his statement, adding that Ethan wouldn't be able to bear leaving him. Ethan then mentioned he'd heard that he was back in town. The name went unspoken, but Marcus's light-hearted demeanor vanished. A heavy silence filled the room. When Marcus didn't respond, Ethan pressed, asking if he still cared about him not to go looking for the man. Marcus shot up from the bed. Ethan's heart seized. He looked up, but Marcus's face was lost in the shadows cast by the moonlight, his expression unreadable, though Ethan could guess it wasn't pleasant. Marcus threw on a robe and left without a word. The decisive click of the door closing confirmed his cold, unyielding stance. And here Ethan had been, foolishly hoping to find some scrap of affection reserved for him. His phone screen lit up. It was a message from Leo with their flight confirmations. He'd booked tickets to 2 different destinations, one set under their own names, the other purchased through a third party. With the time set, Ethan pushed aside his melancholy, wiped his eyes, and began retrieving the various bank cards he had stashed around the apartment. He packed a single suitcase, enough to look like he was heading on a short vacation. After successfully meeting Leo with a pocketful of plastic wealth, they stood together and, under each other's watchful eyes, blocked Julian's and Marcus's numbers. Before he did, Ethan saw Leo's final text to Julian. A simple, "We should get a divorce." Inspired, Ethan sent a similar message to Marcus. "This is over." Marcus replied almost instantly with a single question mark. Ethan decisively blocked him, but his heart began to pound with a sickening rhythm, a premonition that something was terribly wrong. Aboard the plane, this feeling of unease intensified. Leo, carefree as ever, assumed they were safe and promptly fell asleep, his mouth agape, nearly drooling on Ethan's shoulder. But as Ethan stared out the window, a fragment of the novel's plot surfaced in his memory. The original protagonist had also tried to escape on a plane. What he hadn't known was that his lover had installed a tracking chip in his phone. He'd been apprehended the moment he stepped off the aircraft. The thought sent a chill down Ethan's spine. While Leo was just a despised side character, there was no telling what a possessive maniac like Julian might do. When Ethan had first read the story, he'd skimmed the plot, focusing on other aspects, so it was a miracle he remembered such a minor detail. Still, the Julian in the book had been singularly devoted to the protagonist, so perhaps he wouldn't bother pursuing Leo. Clinging to this hope, Ethan spent the flight in a state of anxious torment. The moment they landed and he switched off airplane mode, a flood of notifications appeared. A dozen missed calls from Julian, another dozen from Marcus. Ethan felt as if he were seeing two guillotines poised above his future happiness. He immediately dragged Leo to an electronics kiosk in the terminal, bought 2 new burner phones, smashed their old ones, and tossed them in a trash can. Leo looked ready to strangle him, but, seeing the sheer panic on Ethan's face, grew worried himself. Without time for a full explanation, Ethan quickly had a proxy buy 2 new plane tickets. They grabbed their bags and raced to the next flight, its destination a place Ethan had chosen at random. Only when he was buckled into his new seat did his heart finally begin to calm down. After he explained the situation to Leo, his friend fell silent, staring pensively out the window. About a week later, in their new town, they saw a news report on television about a plane crash. It was, coincidentally, the very flight they had booked but never boarded. Ethan and Leo exchanged a look, a shared, profound sigh of relief passing between them. With any luck, the 2 men would assume they had perished in the accident. At worst, the tracking would lead them to the second flight, but the third was to a picturesque, remote town in Maine that Ethan had picked from a travel brochure. No one would ever find them here. Leo, it turned out, had a deeply hedonistic streak. It was unclear if his 2 years with Julian had awakened something in him, or if he was simply embracing his true nature. But he spent the next few years dragging Ethan to every club and bar they could find. He flirted relentlessly, his hands always finding their way to some handsome man's arm or chest. Life was good. One evening, Ethan was at home cooking when a text from Leo arrived, announcing he wouldn't be home for dinner. Enraged, Ethan immediately started a video call, ready to unleash a torrent of abuse. The man on the other end listened quietly for a moment before switching the call to video. Ethan opened his mouth to yell, but stopped short. The screen was filled with a blonde, blue-eyed man, shirtless, his chest impressively sculpted. He offered Ethan a sweet, dazzling smile. Ethan swallowed hard, his indignation forgotten. Leo's mocking laughter crackled through the speaker. He remarked that the man was here but that his pecs were just average. He took a sip of his drink, gave the chest a couple of squeezes for good measure, and delivered his nonchalant verdict. A moment later, another muscular man leaned into the frame, asking Leo if he wanted to feel his, claiming he'd just been to the gym. Ethan's hand, as if with a mind of its own, reached out to touch the screen. Leo just rolled his eyes in disgust. Ethan couldn't be bothered to care. Leo was paying for everything, and besides, he was the one who insisted Ethan come out with him. Later that night, sufficiently intoxicated, they each brought one of the models home. Not for anything sordid, just to have something beautiful to look at. Leo was generous, and the next morning, Ethan woke to the sight of 2 half-naked men in aprons making breakfast. It was a feast for the eyes. They even brought him a hangover cure. Leo, however, was far bolder than Ethan. While Ethan was content to just look, Leo would drag his chosen companion into his room, claiming they were just going to have a chaste chat under the covers. No one believed him. Still half asleep, Ethan smelled the tantalizing aroma of frying eggs. His stomach rumbled. A moment later, the blonde model entered his room, spatula in hand. He gently shook Ethan awake, informing him that someone was knocking on the door and asking if he should open it. So it wasn't a dream. Ethan wiped the drool from his chin and forced himself out of bed. As he walked into the living room, the knocking grew more insistent, as if the person on the other side was about to blow the door off its hinges. That familiar sense of dread returned. It couldn't be Marcus, he told himself, waving a dismissive hand. He must think Ethan was dead. He yawned and peered through the peephole. It wasn't Marcus. It was Julian Vance. Ethan let out an involuntary gasp. The man outside obviously heard him. Julian stepped forward from a crowd of imposing men in black suits and knocked softly. He stared directly at the peephole, as if his gaze could pierce the door and meet Ethan's. "Open the door," he said. Ethan scrambled back, rushing into Leo's room, ripping the covers off him, and pulling him out of bed. Leo, still dazed from sleep, stumbled after him obediently. Ethan ordered the two models to barricade the door while he dragged Leo into the bathroom. High on the left wall was a small window, just large enough for one person to squeeze through. He patted Leo's shoulder and crouched down. Leo, though confused, understood. He placed a foot on Ethan's shoulder and began to climb as Ethan explained that Julian was outside with a legion of thugs. He felt the body above him stiffen, then a surge of strength as Leo pushed himself upwards. Ethan had never been particularly athletic, and it took a monumental effort to just get a grip on the windowsill. As he struggled to open the window and hoist himself halfway out, Leo's impatient voice came from below, urging him to hurry up and pull him through. Ethan stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. Leo, his own muscles straining, demanded to know what the problem was. Just then, Ethan, perched precariously on the sill, met the eyes of Marcus Thorne, who was standing just outside the window, flanked by his own circle of men in black. Marcus had been wearing a cold expression, but upon seeing Ethan, his face broke into a smile that could be described as radiant, if it weren't so deeply unsettling. The sight of it froze Ethan in place. The next second, Marcus opened his arms wide. "Why don't you jump?" he said, his voice cheerful. "I'll catch you." All Ethan wanted was to go home. Below, Leo was still squirming, pleading with him to hurry before Julian broke in and they were both done for. Ethan let out a grim laugh. He told Leo that even if Julian didn't get in, they were already finished. Under Marcus's dark, unblinking gaze, he meekly climbed back inside. Leo shot him a withering look. Before Ethan could stop him, Leo scrambled up himself. He popped his head out the window and came face to face with Marcus waiting below. Marcus offered him the same gentle smile, though it didn't reach his eyes, making it all the more terrifying. Leo silently climbed back down and sat next to Ethan. Their good life was officially over. Ethan nodded solemnly and, taking out his phone, performed a factory reset. When Julian finally entered, the first thing he saw were two shirtless, muscular men wearing only aprons. Though he'd been prepared for something, his face still darkened. He waved a hand, and his bodyguards swiftly escorted the models out. He took a step toward Leo, his mouth opening as if to speak, but his eyes reddened first. Tears welled up, and Ethan watched, stunned, unsure whether to stay or go. He glanced at Leo, who was frowning, deliberately avoiding Julian's gaze. He was spared from the awkwardness by Marcus, who had come in from somewhere and was now lifting Ethan onto his shoulder. Ethan struggled for a moment, and a sharp slap landed on his rear. He twisted his head around in disbelief, only to see Marcus raise his hand and pat him twice more, a defiant look on his face. He seethed, telling Marcus he could kill him but not humiliate him. As Marcus carried him away, he thought he saw Julian reach for Leo's hand. He roared for Julian to get his filthy paws off him and for Leo to slap him, yelling that if he didn't, he wasn't a man and Ethan would lose all respect for him. His words were answered by a crisp slapping sound and the sight of Julian's head snapping to the side. Marcus just sneered, remarking that instead of worrying about Leo, Ethan should be more concerned with his own fate. He didn't answer Ethan's questions, carrying him in silence all the way to the car. Once inside, it was as if he lost all control. He grabbed Ethan's chin and bit down on his lips, hard. Ethan muffled a cry of pain, which was swallowed by a frenzied kiss. Marcus's tongue was relentless, invading his mouth, stealing his breath, as if he intended to devour him whole. Ethan slapped him across the face, the force of it making Marcus's head turn. He looked back at Ethan, his eyes growing redder against the fresh mark on his cheek, and then he started to cry. Huge, Unexpected tears rolled down his face, splashing onto Ethan's. Ethan was so shocked he couldn't speak. Marcus was still pinning him down, and the awkward position made it impossible for Ethan to either wipe the tears away or offer any comfort. As his mind reeled, Marcus suddenly framed his face with trembling hands. "Do you have any idea how much I regret it?" he choked out. That day, Marcus had bought a black diamond at an auction. He thought it resembled Ethan's eyes, beautiful. He was going to give it to him, hoping it would smooth over their recent tension. But on the way home, he received Ethan's message ending their relationship. When he tried to reply, he found he was blocked. He couldn't understand why. He thought maybe it was the contract. If Ethan didn't like it, they could just get rid of it. He resolved to talk it over when he got home, but the apartment was empty. The housekeeper told him she'd seen Ethan leave with a suitcase, as if for a vacation. A vacation was good, Marcus thought, a chance for him to clear his head. He had his assistant look up Ethan's flight information. It was only a 2 or 3 hour trip. When enough time had passed, he sent a message to Leo, asking where they'd gone. He discovered Leo had blocked him too. A knot of dread formed in his stomach. He called Julian, asking if he knew where they were. Julian had no idea. Marcus told him to try messaging Leo, explaining that he'd been blocked, that Ethan was missing. On the other end of the line, Julian expressed his sympathies for Marcus's predicament, then opened his phone. The first message that appeared was from Leo, "We should get a divorce." Unsurprisingly, he was also blocked. A wave of panic washed over Julian. He abruptly hung up on Marcus and frantically tried to call Leo, only to confirm he was blocked as well. This was bad. He hastily informed Marcus, then told his assistant to cancel his meetings and drive him to the airport. Marcus, too, booked the next available flight and sped toward the airport. Halfway there, his assistant called. "Mr. Thorne," the assistant said, "your flight has been delayed due to a plane crash." The words plane crash pierced Marcus's heart like a sword. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white, veins bulging. "Which flight?" he demanded, cutting the assistant off. "Flight X052. X052 was Ethan's flight. All the color drained from Marcus's face. His breathing stopped. His limbs went numb, and the dull ache in his chest exploded into searing agony, as if a blade were being twisted inside him. There was a deafening crash, a wave of sharp pain, and the feeling of blood obscuring his vision. He heard nothing after that, only the distant, frantic shouts of his assistant through the phone. Now, Marcus buried his face in Ethan's shoulder, his body racked with sobs. The memory still made him tremble uncontrollably, and he tightened his hold, terrified that Ethan would disappear again. He tried to stifle his cries, but it only made him sound more pathetic. Ethan sighed. "Wouldn't it have been better if I died? You could have gone after the person you really love." Marcus looked up, his eyes red and swollen, and glared at him. "Who the hell would I go after?" It took Ethan a moment to process this. He frowned. "You love me?" Marcus just grunted in affirmation, pulling him closer. Ethan pushed him away. "You've got to be kidding. I thought I was just a contract worker." Marcus gave a humorless laugh. He asked what kind of contract worker gets treated so well. Besides, he added, their contract was for a year, and Ethan had never renewed it. His voice trailed off, and he guiltily looked away. Ethan was floored. "You slept with me even though the contract expired?" Marcus, with no leg to stand on, retorted defiantly that he'd given Ethan his salary card, so it was fair game. Ethan demanded to know when he'd ever been given a card, accusing him of lying. "The black card," Marcus said, "the one he'd left on the nightstand that Ethan never took." Ethan thought back and vaguely remembered it. He glanced at it once and thought it looked like some kind of loyalty card for a food delivery service, so he'd ignored it. If he had known it was Marcus's salary card, he would have drained it dry before leaving. Marcus's eyes blinked rapidly. "Come home with me. You can drain it all you want." Ethan refused to believe a word of it. He turned and tried to open the car door, declaring he was going to find Leo. Just then, he saw Julian emerge from the house. He was carrying Leo, whose arms were hanging limply, his head resting on Julian's chest as if he'd passed out. "Leo!" Ethan yelled, pounding a fist against the car window in a panic. The next moment, he saw Leo's dangling hand move. Thinking his eyes were playing tricks on him, he pressed his face against the glass for a closer look. Sure enough, Leo's wrist flickered, and a bank card materialized from nowhere. He waved it subtly in Ethan's direction before quickly hiding it again and resuming his unconscious act. Ethan was speechless. Beside him, Marcus rubbed his swollen eyes and asked quietly if he would come home with him now. Watching Leo being carefully placed into another car, Ethan gritted his teeth and replied, "Why not?" He soon discovered he was under a form of house arrest. The windows were sealed, guards patrolled the property, and Marcus had begun working from home, refusing to let Ethan out of his sight for even a moment. When Ethan protested that this was excessive, Marcus just raised an eyebrow and told him not to make him chain him up. Ethan fell silent for a long moment, then got up to use the bathroom. Marcus asked why he wasn't going. Wasn't he about to burst? Ethan shot back that he couldn't urinate with Marcus staring at him. Marcus looked hurt, muttering that he was just afraid Ethan would run away again. Ethan ignored him. He asked where his phone was. Marcus looked away, feigning ignorance. Ethan specified he needed to contact Leo. Marcus scoffed, assuring him Leo would be fine. Ethan insisted he needed to confirm it for himself, threatening to run away with Leo again if he didn't cooperate. With a sigh, Marcus produced the phone from his own pocket. So that's where it had been. The thief. Phone in hand, Ethan immediately dialed Leo. The first few calls went unanswered, fueling his anxiety. On the third try, someone finally picked up. "Leo?" he said urgently. A hoarse voice on the other end replied, heavy with sleep, punctuated by broken, shallow breaths. "Did Julian hurt you?" Ethan asked. "No," the voice said through gritted teeth. "I'm fine. I'll call you in a few days." The line went dead with a click. Ethan held the phone, silent, and glanced at Marcus, then back at the phone. A sudden, horrified realization dawned on him about what had been happening on the other end of the line. Marcus turned his head away violently, insisting that he would never do something like that in the middle of the day. Ethan gave him a cold smile and pointed to the bite mark on his own shoulder, asking if a dog had done it. He crossed his arms and stared at Marcus. After a long, tense silence, Marcus looked at him and, with perfect seriousness, said, "Woof." After the first time Marcus dragged him to bed, Ethan gave up fighting. Marcus, slick with sweat, leaned in to kiss him, starting at his forehead, moving to the tip of his nose, his gaze finally settling on Ethan's lips. Ethan saw him swallow, then force himself to look away. Since his imprisonment, any attempt at a kiss was met with a swift slap to the mouth. Before, he had tolerated Marcus because of the contract and the plot. Now that the story was in shambles, he saw no reason to be pleasant. But if he was truly honest with himself, Marcus had always treated him well. He never raised his voice, always deferred to him, and unlike the character in the novel, he never hid Ethan away or compared him to the original protagonist. In fact, for most of the contract period, Ethan had felt less like a substitute and more like he was in a real relationship. Lost in thought, he turned and asked Marcus, "When did you fall in love with me?" Marcus lifted him and carried him toward the bathroom. "A long time ago," he said, setting him in the tub and lathering a washcloth with soap. "Why do you love me?" Ethan pressed. Marcus pretended to think for a moment. "I think the way your eyes light up when you see money is cute," he said earnestly. "You're cute when you're angry. You're cute when you're acting. And you're especially cute in bed." "When was I acting?" "When we first signed the contract," Marcus said with a small smile, "and you told me you were deeply in love with me. You saw through that?" "Your acting is average," Marcus admitted. It's a good thing you didn't go into Hollywood. You'd be torn apart by critics. He paused, his tone softening. Besides, I wouldn't want to share you. It's enough that I'm the only one who gets to love you. Ethan didn't know how to respond. He looked so sincere, so deeply in love, that it stirred a strange guilt within him. After the bath, as Marcus gently dried him with a soft towel, he stated that he had no relationship with the so-called protagonist. He never had, and he never would. So, he asked, would Ethan consider staying forever? Ethan turned to him in surprise. The way he said it made it sound as if he knew Ethan wasn't from this world. After that day, Marcus lifted the house arrest. Ethan immediately went to see Leo, with Marcus trailing close behind. When they met up with Julian, Marcus surprisingly gave them space to talk. The moment they were alone, Leo launched into a 30-minute tirade about Julian. Then, his tone shifted, and he asked seriously if Ethan was going to stay. He turned and glanced at the two men standing a short distance away, deep in a serious-looking conversation. I never heard what happened to the protagonist, Leo said, turning back to Ethan. Julian confessed to me too. He said he knows I don't love him that much. Ethan stared at him, stunned. Leo continued, he said he doesn't have much else, but he has money. And if I don't love him, that's fine, because at least I'll love his money. Leo shrugged. I think he has a point. In my world, I was a broke loser. Why wouldn't I stay here? Ethan looked over at Marcus. He felt much the same. It was strange, though. It was almost as if both men knew their real origins. Why overthink it? Leo said with a snap of his fingers. Julian immediately walked over. Leo coughed, and Julian handed him a glass of water. He raised a hand, and Julian naturally pulled out a tissue to dab his lips. Then, their fingers intertwined. Ethan watched them for a long moment, then looked at Marcus. Marcus, taking the hint, quickly came over and took his hand. Fine, he thought. Staying here wouldn't be so bad.